Welcome, dear friends, as I share with you a tale of deep love, overwhelming loss, and the strength of the human spirit to find hope in the aftermath of tragedy. Please enjoy the story.
Allison Watson stepped off the Greyhound bus in the small, sleepy town of Oakwood. The crisp autumn air nipped at her skin as she stood on the dusty platform, her face streaked with tears that had not ceased since her journey began. She had been traveling for what felt like an eternity, the miles stretching endlessly between California and this quiet town nestled in the middle of nowhere. Her heart, broken beyond recognition, had led her here. Oakwood was the last place she expected to find herself, but it was where Andrew had grown up. It was where he had always dreamed of settling down, raising a family, and building a life. Now, Allison was here not to start that life with him, but to find closure. Her life had ended the day Andrew was taken from her in a senseless tragedy, but the tiny, growing life inside her refused to let her give up completely. As much as her heart ached, as much as she longed to join Andrew in whatever afterlife might exist, she couldn't. She wouldn't. She had to keep going. For their baby. For the little girl who would never know her father but would grow up with stories of his love, his laughter, and his dreams. "I have to keep going for you, baby girl," Allison whispered softly, her trembling hand resting on her rounded belly. Squaring her shoulders, she grabbed her battered suitcase with a grip tight enough to turn her knuckles white. The only possessions she had were in that suitcase: a few clothes, a photograph of Andrew, and the memory of the love they had shared. With slow, deliberate steps, she made her way towards the town's main street, her heart heavy with the weight of the journey ahead. It had all started 2 years earlier. At just 19 years old, Allison had been barely scraping by in Los Angeles, a city that never seemed to sleep. Abandoned at birth, she had spent her childhood bouncing between foster homes, never knowing the stability or security that came with having a family. When she turned 18, she aged out of the foster system and was left to fend for herself in a world that seemed intent on pushing her down. She took up a grueling night shift at a local factory, operating heavy machinery while attending technical college classes during the day. Sleep was a luxury she could rarely afford, and life was a relentless cycle of exhaustion and survival. Then, one night, everything changed. Andrew Carter, the new contractor hired to install advanced equipment after the factory's buyout, walked into her life. He was ruggedly handsome, with sandy hair that caught the light and a warm smile that seemed to brighten even the darkest corners of her world. Allison couldn't help but notice how his muscular frame moved confidently as he worked, but she quickly snapped out of her daze when her supervisor barked an order at her. "Allison, get over here and show Mr. Carter how it's done," her boss growled, clearly impatient. Nervously, Allison approached Andrew, her cheeks flushing as she introduced herself. "Hi, I'm Allison. I'll show you how to operate the robotic assembly line," she said, her voice wavering slightly. Andrew's smile widened, and he extended his hand. "Please, call me Andrew. And thank you, Allison. I appreciate your help." From that moment, the two had an easy connection. By the end of her shift, they were chatting and laughing, sharing stories about their lives. Andrew offered to drive her home, saying it was the least he could do after all her patience. That drive home marked the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. A few weeks later, they had their first official date at a small, charming bowling alley. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect. As the months passed, their bond deepened, and by the time Andrew's contract at the factory ended 6 months later, they were inseparable. They shared their dreams, their fears, and their plans for the future. Andrew spoke often about Oakwood, the town where he had grown up, and how he wanted to build a life there one day. He wanted a simple life, one filled with love, family, and purpose. And for the first time in her life, Allison found herself daring to dream of something more than just survival. But their whirlwind romance hit an unexpected speed bump when Allison found out she was pregnant. Just 3 months into their relationship, she discovered the news that would change everything. Terrified of being abandoned once again, just as she had been so many times before, she couldn't keep the secret. As soon as Andrew walked into her apartment, she blurted out the life-altering news. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice shaky and her heart pounding in her chest. She braced herself for the worst, for Andrew to walk out the door and never come back. But to her shock, his face lit up with joy. He pulled her into his arms, his voice filled with excitement. "Marry me, Allison," Andrew said, his words laced with emotion. "Let me take care of you and our family. I want us to be together. Always." Tears. Tears of relief and joy streamed down Allison's face as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." In that moment, everything felt perfect. Allison had never known this kind of love, this kind of acceptance. But soon, her insecurities began to creep in. Andrew mentioned moving to Oakwood once his job was finished, and the thought of meeting his family terrified her. She had never told him about her childhood, about being an orphan, because she feared he, or worse, his family, would judge her for it. "My family doesn't know about my past," she confessed one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared they'll judge me." Andrew, ever the reassuring presence, cupped her cheek gently. "Hey, that's all in the past," he said softly. "You're part of my family now, no matter what. I'll explain everything to my mom and my little brother before we get there, okay? I love you, Allison." With Andrew's words, her fears began to ease. She felt ready to start their new life together, hopeful for the future they would create. But life, as it often does, had other plans. 3 months into her pregnancy, Andrew left for Oakwood ahead of Allison to start setting up their new home. He promised he would return soon, once everything was settled. But weeks turned into months, and there was no word from him. Allison tried calling his family, but all she reached was an impersonal answering machine. Her friends and co-workers whispered behind her back, saying that Andrew must have gotten cold feet and abandoned her. But Allison refused to believe it. She knew Andrew, and she knew that the man she loved would never do something so cruel. With no other options left, Allison made up her mind. If Andrew wouldn't come to her, she would go to Oakwood and find him herself. The small town felt even smaller when she arrived, her heart pounding with uncertainty. The air was thick with the scent of pine trees, and the streets were lined with quaint shops and houses. But none of it mattered to Allison. She needed answers. Clutching her swollen belly, she walked through the doors of the factory where Andrew had worked, hoping someone could tell her what had happened. When her former supervisor saw her, his face fell. He swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. "Allison, didn't anyone tell you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "There was an incident. Shortly after Andrew returned to Oakwood, he was killed." The words hit Allison like a physical blow. Her vision blurred, and her legs gave out beneath her as she collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. How could this be real? How could the man she loved be gone? Through her tears, she barely registered the comforting voice of the office accountant who knelt beside her and gently placed a map in her hand. "He didn't abandon you, honey," the woman said softly. "Andrew was attacked by muggers. It was quick, they said. He didn't suffer. Here. This is where he's laid to rest." In a daze, Allison found herself wandering through the quiet cemetery, clutching the map and the only photograph she had of Andrew. Her heart felt as though it had been ripped from her chest as she searched for his grave. Finally, she stopped before a freshly dug plot. Andrew James Carter, beloved son and brother. The gravestone read. The dates etched beneath his name confirmed the worst. Andrew was gone. "No," Allison whispered, sinking to her knees as reality crashed down on her. Andrew was never coming home. She would have to raise their child alone. As a storm began to roll in, the skies darkened, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Desperate for shelter, Allison stumbled into an old crypt, the only place nearby to escape the rain. Inside, the air was damp and cold, but it provided a small refuge. As she huddled in the corner, wrapping her coat around her, A shrill ringtone shattered the silence. Startled, Allison spotted a smartphone lying on the floor. She picked it up and hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" she said, her voice shaky. "Oh, thank goodness!" a man's voice exclaimed from the other end of the line. "I'm so sorry to bother you, miss, but I lost my phone at the cemetery yesterday. I was working as the architect on a renovation project, and I must have dropped it. Did you find it?" "I think so," Allison replied faintly, pressing a hand to her cramping belly. It was ringing in this old crypt. Before she could finish her sentence, a wave of dizziness overtook her. The phone slipped from her hand as the world around her faded to black. The next thing Allison became aware of was an incessant beeping sound. Slowly, she blinked her eyes open, the bright lights of a hospital room making her squint.